We are welcoming Nina Jankowicz, who is an expert on Russia, Ukraine, and on disinformation. Ms. Jankowicz is a former Fulbright Fellow in Kyiv and has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She's also author of 2 books, How to Be a Woman Online, and before that, How to Lose the Information War. Ms. Jankowicz was selected to serve as executive director of President Biden's Disinformation Governance Board in the Department of Homeland Security earlier this year. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Angie.
I wonder if you could just talk with us a little bit about your expertise, first of all, on Russia, Ukraine, and disinformation.
Sure. So I started my career in the nonprofit sector here in Washington, D.C., working on programs that were supporting democratization in places like Russia and Belarus. And when Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in 2014, the first invasion, I should say, I became really interested in how the internet was being used in order to manipulate public opinion about the war in Ukraine, within Russia, and also here in the United States. And I spent some time as a Fulbright Fellow, as you said, in Kyiv, advising the foreign ministry there on strategic communications and how to counter disinformation. And it was during that time that I became really aware of the fact that the United States and the West writ large approached the issue of disinformation with some hubris, as if we're the first people to experience this, when in reality, our allies in Central and Eastern Europe have been dealing with this for decades during the Soviet period and are very familiar with Russian disinformation as it stands today. And that's when I became interested in it and wrote my book and tried to bring those lessons home to the United States.
I want to ask you about the board, the Disinformation Governance Board. This spring, of course, President Biden asked you to lead that board, and what could have been a high professionally became very quickly a low. Only 3 weeks later, you were resigning from that position and felt compelled to do so. Could you talk a little bit about the circumstances surrounding that?
Sure. So I began the position as executive director of the Disinformation Governance Board in March. And the board was meant to be a coordination mechanism for the Department of Homeland Security, which is a fairly large government department with lots of disparate mission sets within it. And my role was to bring those mission sets together to make sure that the functions that were being carried out in countering disinformation about natural disasters, about disinformation at the border, about cybersecurity, that we were all kind of walking to the beat of the same drummer, right? It wasn't anything about censoring Americans. In fact, the board was set up in order to make sure that DHS was doing its work with regards to privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties, making sure that we weren't stepping on any of those really important American values, right? And instead, that got taken out of context. It got smeared by folks on both the far right and the far left of the spectrum who called the board a ministry of truth. And again, it's really important to say the board had no power and could not have had any power to censor or adjudicate what was true or false on the internet. And unfortunately, as I said, the board was attacked. I was attacked. I was 8.5 months pregnant at the time, and me and my family received violent threats. I received a lot of sexualized hate and letters to my house. We were doxxed, which means that our personal information was leaked onto the internet. It was a really difficult time, and I would have stood by that work and stood up for it had the administration decided to defend it. But unfortunately, the administration decided to kind of kowtow to these attacks, and I decided to do more work in the civil society sector. I believe that outside of government, I can do just as much, if not more, good than within the government at this juncture.
So the irony here is that misinformation and disinformation, you feel, derailed the board and your work that you were positioned to do there. And you also were effectively the victim of a great deal of cyberbullying because of the disinformation and misinformation, people misunderstanding what the intention of the board was.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was highly ironic as well because my book about online abuse had just come out. And unfortunately, I had to put a lot of the skills that I wanted to impart upon other women to use for myself. And I had never thought that in a fairly low ranking position in the US government, I wasn't Senate confirmed, right? This was just a normal kind of political appointment, that there would be so much scrutiny. But I think these attacks were gendered. I don't think they would would have happened to a man or an older man, certainly. But as a young woman, people were very gleefully ripping apart my life. And I think we need to look at that as Americans and think about, that's not just the cost of doing business. That's not a normal kind of political outcome. And we should all reject that no matter our political party.
And we should all be very concerned about that and make sure that we are not participating in something that is, unnecessarily hateful or unfair. At the same time, I wonder if you feel that there might have been any impetus for fighting this board that was reasonable. Virginia's Attorney General, Jason Miyares, led a number of states in opposing the board. I know I've just recently spoken with some First Amendment rights folks who felt that the board was positioning itself to tell social media, for example, what could or could not be posted. Hunter Biden's laptop, you've heard that has come up quite a bit. People characterizing your position on that one way, you saying that's not really true. That wasn't to be the role of the board, though, to tell people what could or couldn't be on social media, correct?
That's absolutely correct, Angie. The Attorney General's lawsuit, as well as other lawsuits that have been brought up, are frankly all for show. They are not based in reality and the reality of what the board was able to do. The board had no operational authority, and I would not have taken that role if my job were to be to tell social media companies what was allowed to be posted on the internet. That's absolutely not what it was. The board was about bringing to bear best practices for the civil servants who were working on counter disinformation activities within the Department of Homeland Security, things like media literacy. I think we can all agree that educating Americans about how to find good information online in a time of such tumult and a time of information just flooding towards us at all hours of the day and night, I think we can all agree that that's a good thing. That's the sort of thing that I wanted to work on in my time in government. But I absolutely understand that Americans want to treat these efforts with a little bit of skepticism, and they have every right to do that, but we should do that respectfully.
You seem undeterred at this point in your commitment to fighting disinformation, the deliberate spread of false information meant to harm other people. Can you just summarize, if you can, briefly, what it is that you would advise individual American citizens to do to fight disinformation and misinformation, but disinformation?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to understand is that disinformation preys on our emotions, and it preys on the infrastructure of social media, which is built on those emotions. So I often like to say that the most enraging content online is the most engaging content online. So when you feel yourself getting emotional, stop, take a breath, and then maybe do a little bit more digging about what this information is that you're being targeted with, who's targeting it at you, and why. Think about that before you hit the share button.
Mm-hmm. And do some fact checking, right? Find out if it's true or not. Can you find it with multiple sources so that you know that it may be true, from reliable sources so you know it may be true, right? Stop, breathe, think, don't just share. Okay, excellent advice.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much for being with us. That's Nina Jankowicz, who is an expert on Russia, on Ukraine, and on disinformation, combating disinformation for the good of all of us. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
We spoke with Gary Lakowski with the Dillon Law Group based in Alexandria. Mr. Lakowski is an expert on election law and the First Amendment and a senior fellow at the Institute for Free Speech. He recently testified before a congressional hearing regarding the impact of disinformation on elections and freedom of expression. And we want to thank you, Gary, for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Could you talk just a little bit about your work as a senior fellow at the Institute?
Sure. So I got involved with the Institute because free speech is something I'm very passionate about. I think it's important. I think it kind of undergirds all the other freedoms we have. Representative government only works if we, the people, are able to communicate our views back to our elected representatives. So that's how I got involved initially with the idea of free speech and with the Institute. And my work there has been wonderful. It's been a wonderful opportunity to kind of put those principles into action and kind of pursue different avenues for improving the speech environment in the country today, where frankly it is a very challenging environment.
Okay. Well, I imagine, I mean, we're beyond the information age. There's just information everywhere. Seems like everyone's talking. Not necessarily a lot of people listening, but everyone seems to be talking. I want to know about the concerns for free expression that that actually created a lot of pushback in the spring when President Biden created the Disinformation Governance Board under Homeland Security. A lot of people did object to that. Some people referred to it as the Ministry of Truth and spoke of fears of having the government involved in regulating people's speech. There are others who said that that was a misunderstanding. I'd like to know about your concerns as it relates to the government being involved in the regulation of free speech.
So I'm a native Virginian. I grew up in Northern Virginia. I spent some time down in Charlottesville. I spent a lot of time in the Commonwealth. And like anyone who's spent a lot of time in the Commonwealth, I've gone up and down I-95 a few times, gone up and down I-64 a few times. You'll notice if you go up and down those roads, there's a lot of crazy drivers out there. You know, sometimes you'll be going down the road, there'll be someone who's very slow, just plodding along in the left lane. It's driving you nuts. Other times you'll be going down the road and someone will blow by you. Seems like they're going about 120. Everywhere you look, it seems like there's some other maniac on the road. Now, the problem with regulating disinformation is much like the problem with driving. I think I'm a good driver, and I think all the other people are the maniacs, but many other people also feel the same way. Everybody thinks they're a good driver. Everybody thinks it's the other people who have the problem. And it's the same with disinformation. We all think we're good at ferreting out what's true and what's not. Yet the truth is, we may not be. We have to approach these problems with a certain level of humility. And the problem with getting government involved with that is that's the last institution you want to do that. That's an institution that has tremendous power to try to impose its views on the people. And also, when government gets involved in that, it sort of inverts the relationship that's supposed to be there between the people and the government. Yeah.
Okay, so, but now we should probably differentiate here. There's a difference between disinformation and misinformation. And I think that we can all acknowledge in this day and age that there are bad actors, both inside and outside the country, who are intentionally working to subvert information, to manipulate people in ways that are not beneficial for America or for Americans. So how do we address that?
The solution to bad speech is more speech. Now, in the marketplace of ideas, it's the good ideas, it's the true ideas that will often come to the forefront and predominate in that discussion. So where you have malicious actors, where you have people who are trying to do bad things, and they are out there, the solution to that is to correct them. You know, it's like there's an old prayer of I believe it's St. Francis out there. Where there's error, let us correct it. And that's what we need to do. Where there's error, where there are people who are saying things that are wrong, where there are people who are trying to manipulate the environment by saying intentionally incorrect things, the solution is to correct them and to correct them civilly through other speech, not to try to suppress speech.
Okay, you're referencing St. Francis of Assisi. I am familiar with that prayer. I want to know, though, again, if you feel that there's no role for the government. And you personally have had a distant past relationship with the Department of Homeland Security, right? When you were a student in law school at UVA, you did an internship there. So this is something you understand and value, that there's a need for national security, correct?
There's absolutely a need for national security in a general sense. You know, there are threats to our nation and we need to defend against them, be they nation states, be they terrorist groups. But what you don't want government doing is getting into the business of deciding what's true and what's not true. That's something they're not really set up to do. And I mean, I'll use myself as an example. I interned with the Department of Homeland Security when I was in my early 20s as a law student. Would you want an early 20-year-old student deciding what's true and what's false and telling people who say something, oh, you can't say that? I know I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't have wanted myself to have that power and that responsibility. And I wouldn't want others to have that over me or over the rest of our discourse.
So agencies like our intelligence agencies, the CIA, the FBI, I mean, these are people who have been involved with disinformation for decades, because I think, can we agree that disinformation can be used as a weapon to harm our national security? And do you think there's no role there at all for government?
The role for government in those cases is to be a credible broker of information and to put out its own speech to counter that misinformation. Our national security establishment functions at its best in the sort of mis and disinformation sphere when it's viewed credibly, when people look at information coming out of the Pentagon, coming out of Langley, coming out of the FBI, and can believe that information and trust that that's true. And that's a long, hard process that takes building up, that takes being accurate, that takes being careful and approaching situations with humility and in those statements you make. And frankly, that just takes time in building up that credibility to be viewed as a credible broker. So that's the way for the government to combat mis and disinformation, is to combat it with truthful information, not to try to suppress things that it views as false or that it views as misleading. And part of the reason for that is because it just, frankly, government they're not good at identifying what's true and what's false in all circumstances. There's no reason to believe that government is not subject to the same kind of failings as you, me, any other person. We all have our own biases. We all can have a bad day. We all can have our own sort of blinders to certain informations and certain sources. And we've seen that play out time and again.
Sure. And people can make mistakes, and agencies can make mistakes. Governments can make mistakes, and they're not always ill-intentioned mistakes. So can we find some common ground here between you and the people who say we need to be more active in combating disinformation? Are you willing to agree? Do you think the Institute, in fact, would agree that there are measures that can be taken so long as those measures don't infringe on the individual rights of American citizens to express their views?
Yes, but I think the devil's in the details with that, by what you mean by infringe upon the rights of individual Americans to express their views. I think particularly if you're seeing situations where government's reaching out to media companies and saying, don't air this view, or you need to suppress this because we don't think this is true, or we think this is disinformation, when, say, with the Hunter Biden laptop, it turned out to be true.
Got it.
Or say in other circumstances. So I think that the way you do that is by government putting out its own version of events and allowing the people to comment on that and to come to their own conclusions, rather than trying to enforce a narrative of this is the one true narrative.
Okay, I think we're really hearing you now, and I think that this is the beginning of a much longer conversation that we can't have at this moment. But thank you so much for coming on our program and talking with us about this important topic.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay, take care.
Thank you for watching. Continue to follow Virginia News and Stories by subscribing to our VPM YouTube channel.